Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President and colleagues, as today's debate begins to wind down, I want to rise to join those who have called for the passage of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Years ago, when the United States was in the early stages of conflict in Vietnam, I was fortunate to win a Navy ROTC scholarship to attend Ohio State. During my freshman year there, as spring break approached, our commanding officer called in a bunch of us freshmen, midshipmen, to send. He said, "I got a deal for you. How would you like to have an all-expenses-paid trip to Quantico, Virginia over spring break?" And that's where the Marine officers trained after going to college. We all raised our hands and said, "Count us in." On our way, one day off, we had 5 days in Quantico and more. One day off, we took a train to Union Station in Washington, D.C., just 3 or 4 blocks from here. And from there, most of my fellow midshipmen found their way to watering holes in Georgetown. I chose to visit Capitol Hill. It's a place I'd never been. That day, I walked up Delaware Avenue and past this building, somehow find my way into the Rayburn House office building, just a short distance from where we're gathered today. I walked up to a security officer there and asked if there are any hearings underway that I might try to sit in on. He said, "Yep." He directed me to a long line leading to the House Judiciary Committee room. And after a long wait, I finally had the chance to find a seat and watch in person the debate over what would later become the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I was glued to that seat for hours, mesmerized by what I said and what I heard. Later, back on the train to Quantico that evening, my friends asked me what I had found on Capitol Hill and that day, and I told them I thought I may have found my future. And as it turned out, I did. That day and in the days to come, those hearings, inspired by the civil rights movement, forced a spotlight on the discriminatory state laws that had made it nearly impossible for many Black Americans to vote 100 years after the end of the Civil War. Years earlier, my sister and I had grown up in Danville, Virginia, the last capital of the Confederacy. There, we saw racial discrimination up close and personal. Even as children, we knew it was wrong, and we knew it had to change. Sitting in Rayburn years later, I found the place where I thought, just maybe, I might be able to help do something to right that wrong. Nearly 18 years later, since sitting in that hearing room, after I'd finished my studies and completed my 3rd deployment to Southeast Asia as a naval flight officer during the Vietnam War, I found myself back on Capitol Hill in these halls, this time serving alongside of John Lewis in the House of Representatives. And after years of blatant discrimination and voter suppression, specifically targeted at Black Americans, we began to witness change. It came slowly at first, and then more quickly. Thanks to the tireless efforts of people like our friend John Lewis, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gained increasingly popular bipartisan support over the years. In fact, as we heard earlier, by 2006, the vote to extend the Voting Rights Act was unanimous. Imagine that, 98-0. Think about it, 98-0. And today, 16 of the Republican colleagues who voted for it, among those 98, are still here. Given that history, however, it's almost unbelievable to think that the right to vote is under attack once again in many parts of our country. Today, in states across America, state legislators and some governors are seeking to enact a wave of voter restrictions, many of them with the sole purpose of making it harder to vote, often specifically targeting Black Americans. In 2021 alone, 19 states passed some 34 laws restricting the right to vote. How? Well, by allowing partisan observers to intimidate independent poll workers in Texas, by pulling drop boxes and ballot applications out of the hands of voters and imposing penalties for poll workers in Florida who are just trying to do their jobs. In Georgia, it's okay to make The poll lines longer and longer, but you can't bring food or water to the voters who wait in them sometimes for hours to vote. Hours. We know that in many parts of America, black voters have to wait in lines for twice as long as white voters to cast their ballots. Twice as long. And in some places for up to 6 hours. That's not just morally wrong, and it's an assault on who we are as a people. How can we look at what's happening and not ask, for God's sake, can't we do better than this? Indeed, we must. Let me leave you with one idea that worked in 1965 and just might work again in 2022. You know, every day across our country, Americans gather in places of worship. Every major religion in the world relies on one common principle that bolsters our connection to each other. The Golden Rule. The idea that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. The idea that we ought to treat people the way we want to be treated. Most Americans would be surprised to learn that admonition is repeated almost weekly in multiple Bible studies and prayer breakfasts that are regularly held here on Capitol Hill throughout the year. It's a shared belief across religious, ethnic, and party lines that the person across from us is just as valuable as us, just as deserving of love and dedication as we are and our loved ones are. In 1965, the Golden Rule was a foundational principle for equality in the Voting Rights Act. Congress was guided by it. In fact, every major religion on this planet embraces it. I don't care if you're Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and it goes on. The Golden Rule is in your teachings, in your beliefs. And you hear it here in this body, in this building, week in and week out. Maybe, just maybe, it's about time for us to rely on it once again in this land of the free as we seek to connect our values and our faith to our actions. Most of us will recall that both Dr. King and the preamble of our Constitution call on us to work to make this a more perfect union and fulfill the promise of our founders that all men and women are created equal. And while across our country today, we're seeing a growing wave of voter restrictions, I'm reminded of what Martin Luther King said many years ago. He said this, he said, "Only when it's dark enough can we see the stars." Think about it. Only when it's dark enough can we see the stars. And sometimes it's only when we are tested as a nation that our true spirit shows itself. I pray that this is just one such time. So while none of us hoped to would ever face these challenges in our democracy, to our democracy in the year 2022, perhaps we can take some comfort in knowing that someone else has walked this path before us. All these years later, we feel that fierce urgency of now that Dr. King spoke of 5 years before, providing us both with a moral blueprint and the encouragement to do something with that. As I close, let me just say, having said all that, let me reiterate that this is not a time to wait and dawdle. Congress needs to regroup. When we leave this building this day, this week, and then act with the same sense of urgency as an earlier Congress did in 1965 when it passed the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in order to better protect the sacred right to vote and uphold the sanctity of our electoral processes. The legislation before us today seeks to make clear what we as a nation aspire to be. It makes clear that no one who is eligible should be denied the sacred right to vote. Let me close, colleagues, by observing that in the end, we can quote Dr. King and praise my friend John Lewis until the cows come home. But when Americans' sacred right to vote is on the line, it's our responsibility to uphold our oath to the Constitution and get on with it. I don't know. I never knew Dr. King. I knew John Lewis, know him well, love him. But I don't know if Dr. King or John Lewis were fans of Mark Twain. I am. And I want to close by paraphrasing the words of Mark Twain. And this is that paraphrase. When in doubt, do what's right. You'll amaze your friends and confound your enemies. Well, friends, time has come to do just that, to do both of those things. And that's why no barrier should stand in the way of our sacred obligation to protect this democracy. And with that, I yield the floor. Thank you.